Nowadays, we often hear about mental health in broad terms. But what about the silent struggles the men carry quietly, or the invisible effect of the technology placing on our kids? In today's episode, we dive into both. Welcome to Discovering Journeys, and I'm your host, Sujala. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Eilers, a licensed professional counselor with years of experience working with diverse clients across age groups. Patrick opens up about the emotional hurdles men face when it comes to seeking help and why so many suffer in silence. We also explore how growing up in a digital first world is reshaping the landscape for our children. If you have ever wondered how technology is really impacting your child, or if you're someone or know someone quietly struggling with mental health as a man, this conversation is for you. Let's start. Hello, Patrick. Happy to have you on Discovering Journeys. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I'm kind of drawn to speak about men's mental health and mental health on adolescents. Before we get into it, I want to ask you what drew you to this field of work?
Early on in my career, certainly before I got into therapy, my goal, I kind of had a position when I was in high school, specifically when I was an adolescent or so. I kind of felt like, people were drawn to me and talked to me about different things. And so, I kind of was honing my listening skills pretty early in my life, and never had like a real like specific talent in high school that I really liked or liked to do. I was not really super good in sports. I was never really interested in mathematics or those kind of areas like that. So for me, I just kind of was looking for something that, would allow me to help people, but also at the same time kind of stay away from math or medical stuff, because I'm not really good with blood either. So at the time, psychology sort of was one of those things where I kind of, I've said this in our podcast, I don't have a super deep interest in the science of psychology, so to speak, but I have an interest in people and wanting people's stories to be healed. So that's what kind of started me down the journey. I kind of felt called to it, pretty early in my life, and it kind of let me just continue to working through school. And as eventually, when I got on the other side of that process, which was 8 years for me, I think throughout my process of being a therapist, I think the thing that continues to drive me into doing it is, again, there's a need for people, and I've always tried to do the best I could to put myself in positions where people have a need for that, because there's a strong desire for people to and not only so much in our culture as much, but I think certainly the idea just we're becoming more comfortable with talking to people and being more open about things that we struggle with. So
How has the counseling landscape evolved, especially post-pandemic?
yeah, I think that this is something that when we talk a little bit about, obviously the virtual side of it, I think has been a big part of it. I mean, there was very little, if any, virtual sessions. We kind of were just starting kind of getting into, I was working for a kind of a startup practice before the pandemic, and there were very few, virtual sessions. Most virtual sessions that had happened in the past were related to like having a phone call. There was not even a face-to-face kind of virtual session that way, which always presented its own kind of challenge, certainly. And then post-pandemic, we've kind of flipped the switch on that. And this has become kind of the more standard, or a lot more people are comfortable with this. There's been more people lately, I've noticed, and some of the work that I've done lately, that depending on their age, they certainly feel more comfortable being face-to-face. I've kind of adapted to it, where I was like, either way works for me, but I do feel like face-to-face has a certain level of value to it that virtual can't give. But I do think the other side of virtual is that it does, I wouldn't say it limits how important it is, but I think there's people who take it a little less seriously. I think it's more likely, and I've had several clients or people that I've done like the first session with, and they've been in the drive-through ordering, Burger King or something. So it's like, so I've had situations like that where it's like virtual kind of, it separates people so much that there's an element of it that I don't need to take this as seriously as maybe I would if I had to come into an appointment. I think the other thing that has been part of it as well is that because there's more people talking about it, it's kind of become, I don't want to say fad-like, or like people are just doing it because they find it to be something everybody else is doing. But I do think that it has created a little bit of this nature of, well, I need help, but I need support. I'm not going to get it from my actual support system. So I'm going to kind of go through the therapist route. And in doing that, it kind of, again, creates this space where there's a difference between kind of mental wellness. It's like a continuum. There's mental wellness on one side, there's mental health on the other side. And there's some people who genuinely need to be in mental health and they need to work on consistent therapy. And then there's a group of people who work with mental wellness, and that's the life coaches and the coaches and the coaching side, which I've done some work in the last year or so with. So I think that particular idea of those two, that spectrum, I think there's more people probably needing more mental wellness services than they necessarily need a mental health service. I know we kind of talk about it's hard to really measure that kind of stuff. It's just there's hard to give a number to it. But I do think that those are a couple of the big things that have changed within sort of the landscape. Is that virtual has really made the pandemic made virtual again accessible, which has been a good thing. But at the same time, does that also make it more of a commodity because of that?
Children today are flooded with screens, whether be it for entertainment, social, schoolwork, projects, research, connection, being part of friends group, whatever you say it. So it's everywhere and we cannot avoid it. That's the bottom line. What are some of the concerning aspects or a pattern have you seen happening currently in the adolescents?
Well, with adolescents, I think there's certainly an element of people not being able to connect, get it face to face. Like kind of we were just talking about, right? Screens have become kind of the norm, and so for a lot of people, there's accessibility, that's great, but on the other hand of it is that if you don't, just because accessibility is there doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing if they become saturated with it. So I do think there's certainly an element of you lose some of those connections that you had from nonverbals, you lose some of those connections from being able to connect with folks. You get the more isolated. I mean, I've noticed even myself, the less you go out, the more likely that you want to go out, right? You just don't really want to put up with all the things that go on out there, the more you just want to stay in. So I do think there's an element of that. I mean, we're social creatures, social beings. We need to be connected with people. It's healthy for us to do that. Now, it doesn't mean we have to be saturated with it on the other side. We don't have to be spending time with people all the time. That's kind of unhealthy too. But I think there's a certain element where the screen has created that space. Again, there's so much done online. One issue I would say with adolescence that gets underlooked, and I would say it's kind of true for men and women and adolescents, but certainly for men as well, in my experience, is that just the role of pornography and the role of the sexual behavior online certainly is that I mean, there are no rules to that, and that's one of the things that's become has obviously become a concern for folks as time has gone on. And really since the internet's been around, everybody to some degree has had some sexual, I wouldn't say deviancy, but certainly some kind of sexual behavior online, probably, or most people have, one way or the other. But I do think that that's another aspect where, from an adolescent perspective, a lot of folks who are really young, that's their coping skill. Their coping skill is to turn to pornography. They started at a very young age, 8, 9, 10 years old. They get curious about it, and then ends up becoming kind of their coping skill. There's a lot of shame and guilt around it, and that affects a lot of relationships down the road. So one of the things that we talk about, or I've talked about in our podcast, is the dating culture. And so that's affecting a lot of adolescents because they get kind of hooked on pornography very early. How is that affecting our dating? How is it affecting how we see relationships, and et cetera? And so I do think there's a large domino effect of that kind of thing where people, are using this as something as a way to feel better, kind of self-medicating in that way. And because they're using it at such an early age, that's just their norm. Nobody really knows about it. And so then what ends up happening is down the road, they're 20 years old, 30 years old, whatever. And now they're having a hard time dating because they have all these different things that have affected them from pornography. So I do think that's a part of the adolescence that's not really brought up a lot. But I saw it a lot when I worked with addiction, is that, most people that I worked with, most guys I worked with, if they're under the age 40, they've had some type of story that's like that, very similar type of, I'm kind of in the same age range too. I've had a similar type of story myself. Like, I've existed pre-internet, but I've never existed. I existed post-internet as well, but we've never had a full generation of people who, from birth to death, have had the internet. So we don't really know too much about how that's going to affect everyone in that sense. But just based on what we've seen, I do think that's pretty hard. It's pretty easy to say that that's going to be a continued role with adolescents, growing, continuing to move forward. And then you get into the real world with sex robots and virtual and AI, all that kind of stuff. But I do think that pornography just by itself currently as it stands is a major effect on adolescents and in their role of how they use the internet.
Oh, this is a whole new topic, but it's not spoken much about, as rightly you pointed it out. What can the schools or parents or caregivers can do, not specifically on this topic, but generally in the adolescence age, to have a healthy dialogue about what technology can do to them. But the rules and the way we are adapting, I feel there is a huge gap between how we are and how way the technology is. And in between, there are the kids who doesn't know what is what, especially in that age. So
Well, it's a lot easier for me to talk about it not as a parent because I'm not a parent, but I can imagine being a parent that you would have, I think and again, I use the word balance, and that's an easy thing for me to say, a hard thing to execute. I think from that perspective. So what can parents and what can the school do? I mean, I think very very specifically as far as the parents go. I mean, again, I look at it as what you allow or what you know about is what you allow in. What you don't know about is, you're not going to necessarily know. Again, you don't always know. Maybe a better way of putting it is you don't necessarily know what you allow in, what you don't allow in when it comes to the internet. I think from a very early age, especially 4, 5, 6 years old, probably a heavy duty limitation to the screen. I mean, if school uses it, okay, that's fine. But like beyond that, probably being pretty limited with what you allow. Older kids, and I say older, I mean like, 10 years old, like we kind of talked about. I think there is a conversation around the idea of like, look, this isn't something that's easy for me to talk about. It's not easy for you maybe to hear. It's going to be uncomfortable for all of us, but this is what the internet can do, and just kind of give some basic general examples. Now, I think you don't have to get graphic with pornography and what all that is and those kind of things. I just mean like, I think opening that dialogue means that, hey, look, the internet has dangers. Yeah, it's great that you can go play X game, great, you can go on YouTube, whatever. But there is some dangers here. And you have to respect those dangers. Just like you go to I'll use the zoo as in, you go to the zoo, there's signs about don't feed the animals for secure reasons, right? So it's kind of the same thing. It's great to look at the animals, but don't go to the animal. Don't necessarily go there to, feed them, interact with them, climb in their cage, etc.
no, that's a great analogy.
And that's kind of like the internet, right? The internet has great things to interact with it, but don't necessarily climb into the space where it's going to be. And again, a lot of times it's because people don't know what they don't know. And then I think as you get into being an adolescent, certainly the role has to become more about this is the serious danger of what the internet provides. Now, you may not be able to control it. I think that's another aspect. I think that's something that, as a parent, it's hard to necessarily always fully, I use the word embrace. It's hard to embrace that necessarily because you want to have some level of authority and control. And I think, obviously you certainly do to some degree, but it's that relationship you have with your child that's going to continue to build off of that. So I think there's an element of, hey, look, like I can't make you not go on a porn site, or I can't make you, spend 6 hours or 16 hours, and say 16 hours on your phone or whatever. But I can tell you that if you do those things, this is how it's going to maybe affect down the road. It doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen to you. So I don't want to scare you about that, but I also want to be realistic of the fact that I'm concerned about it in this way. And this is why I'm concerned about it. One of the things about, and I'll use pornography as an example again, but one of the things that I've heard a lot from people is that, nobody really understood why it was something they shouldn't do. It was just, hey, don't do this. Okay, well, that's great. But at the same time, like, why don't I do this? And I think that element brings more curiosity, especially for people who are younger. And so you pursue stuff that you're interested in. There's a science says don't go in here. I'm probably going to go in there to a certain degree. It's part of the human nature, but I need to know why I shouldn't go in there, for example. So I think that that's part of it where, parents need to talk more about the reason behind why it's a problem, not necessarily because you shouldn't do it. I mean, I think there's an element where there's a balance with that, like I said, but a majority of that conversation comes from what is behind that. So certainly there's an element of that where like, hey, this is something at that age. I think once you get to be over 18, and I know there's a lot of parents who have relationships with their adult children, we all do to some degree, but certainly closeness of that. And again, because kids are staying home younger, et cetera, those kind of things. At that point, you really have to kind of say, okay, like, hey, if, maybe I have house rules, like, hey, you're not allowed to do these things in my house or whatever. I understand that there's certainly a limitation to that as well, again, but maybe that's where, some of those same kind of conversations continue with a little more depth of, hey, this is how it affected me. Maybe I had a struggle with pornography and this is what I'm concerned about that way. Or maybe I had a struggle with screens or whatever. I do think all these things have a little bit of an ability to become addictive. And I use that word lightly because I think that sometimes the word addictive is, again, it's similar behavior over and over and over again. But a lot of it's because, again, especially with screens, people report this pretty frequently, is that they tend to sort of just zone out. They sort of dissociate in that way. And so when they do that, it just helps them to not feel all the emotions that they may feel when they're not on the screen. So just as an example for that, again, how much of these things are people really doing because they want to feel better? Or are they doing this because they just don't know what else they can do? There's a lot of different things that can be there. But I think opening that door with kids is a lot of those conversations are also introducing kids to things that keep them away from those kind of things with the screen. So introducing them to things that are more physical, right? So, being outside, going for hikes, going to the gym, engaging with our kind of hobbies that are much more physical, where you build stuff, where photography, all different kind of things like that, where you're engaging more in those ways than necessarily just saying, here's a screen, occupy yourself with a game, those kind of things. So again, there's a balance to that, but I think the balance looks different for every person, looks different for every parent. I would say it looks different for every kid. You might have some kids who love their computer and they do a lot of creative stuff on their computer and you have no concerns about them. Then you have another group of kids over here that, they may do really well with sports and or do a lot of physical activity, but when they do have their phone, they're much more likely to do something that's going to potentially be harmful to them. So I think it really depends on, you also utilizing your own parental guidance and knowledge and your understanding of your own child.
Is digital burnout becoming common?
It feels like it is, but at the same time, it feels like it isn't. If that makes sense, it seems like we're digitally burned out from things that involve us having to be on a screen for something that involves us making money, like going to work or doing something like that. But there's less digital burnout with like social media and those kind of things. And I don't know if that's because social media has a drama effect to it, and there's people are drawn to that aspect no matter what, because that could be on any screen or it could be on not screen. So there could be that aspect of it, but I think that we probably have. I like the word you use, overstimulation. I think there's probably an overstimulation culture wide that we just there's nothing that again, it's kind of the shock value of things. Maybe that's why a lot of things have to be kind of higher and higher and higher, and that's why you hear more and more things you don't know are true, because there has to be some level of sort of attraction to it. So that's an aspect I think is absolutely true. So I don't know if I'd use digital overstimulation. I think would probably be a better way of putting that. But I agree with you. I think certainly digital burnout is.
Now, moving on to the men's mental health. What have you observed on this topic? Hey, listener, thank you for tuning into Discovering Journeys. If you are enjoying this conversation, I would love for you to take a quick moment to follow the podcast on Instagram so you never miss these incredible stories and learnings. Also, please consider sharing it with a friend or leaving a review, as it goes a long way in helping more people discover this podcast. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Well, a lot of what we kind of spoke on, has been true for most of my experience working with guys. And I think one of the things that, sort of limits men, or maybe not limits men, but certainly limits men from seeking out help, is that there's always this idea that, strength and weakness are almost reversed. Like if I show that I need help, if I show that I need a support, if I show that I need some kind of support system or whatever, I'm demonstrating weakness over strength, where isolationist is much more of a strength position. That mentality across the board limits men for mental health, period, because there's not a desire to want to go and seek any kind of training, help, et cetera, in that way. Kind of like what I spoke to earlier, I think that the mental wellness space for men probably is an untapped potential in that sense, because, again, therapy has this connotation, at least I observe connotation that's very much like, that's the last thing you do when you have no other options. That's where you go. That's much more of what like my partner would do, or a female might do in that case. So there's kind of that way. There's a lot of hesitancy going into it, and even if there's not hesitancy going into it, it's also when you step into it, then how deep are you going to get? A lot of men kind of have the initial like, hey, this is what's going on. We talk through it, and then that's kind of as far as that goes. There's not much more beyond that. Whereas somebody who might be a female might come in, and they may spend a lot of time cultivating. I always use the example when I work with guys about like a garden. So women tend to look at the relationship of their life sort of like a garden. There's always going to be things that are going to be alive, and there's always going to be things that are going to be dead. But the things that are dead, usually most women want to go understand why those things are dead. And in order to do that, they're going to have to go put their hands in the dirt, feel the dirt, understand what the dirt is telling them. Is it too hard? Is it too soft? Does it need more water? What do I need to do in order to cultivate this area of the garden? Men look at a lot of mental health, seemingly, that they look at more like an engine. The head gasket's blown on this motor. I'm going to take the valve covers off, take the head gasket off, replace the head gasket, put the valve cover back on, the motor should run fine again. And a lot of times I see this observation in regards to how they deal with relationships, like, especially with intimate relationships. It's like, well, if I do this thing differently, then my partner will be okay with me. Well, not necessarily. There's going to be a a domino effect of other things they're gonna have to deal with. Just because you fix this first part doesn't mean over here it won't be. That's why I like the garden analogy, because a lot of times men will assume that their entire relationship is, underwater. And it's like, no, there's parts of this garden that are alive. That's why you still have this relationship. Which there are parts of the relationship you got to work on. So I like that analogy, because I think that that's really kind of how mental health is approached with men most of the time. It's like, if I fix this one thing, everything else will be fixed, and that's not necessarily true. And kind of going back again to, like I said, with the pornography piece, is that a lot of times, again, there's how much of these behaviors that men might look at as being unhealthy. That's a big one. So there's an element of stress where men might say, well, that's just life, or hey, I do these things to feel better. It's not affecting anybody. It's nothing personal. And those are, and some to some degree, I mean, I can see why they would feel that way. But at the same time, I also know that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to lead to long-term health, which is why I say I feel like the wellness space is something that a lot of men would benefit from, not because they necessarily can't navigate their life, but because that they can utilize that help in order to be able to improve their life. And so again, also that same question comes up, does a man, or does a person who understands their life want to really improve it? Sometimes that's a big part of it too. You can be men and women. That's a struggle sometimes. Or am I comfortable with what I have? Because again, sometimes being able to improve things means you got to be more uncomfortable than you are if you keep them the same. So there's certainly an aspect, I think, of that comes up quite a bit with men, and going into, not A, having the desire to step into therapy, B, being able to continue the journey of therapy, and then C, being able to take what they've learned and being able to then apply it. Because I've also ran into a lot of people where, they love coming in and talking. They love doing that. They're really good at that. They enjoy it. But there's very little application of like, hey, these things probably would help you in these areas. Like, it's hard to bring those into place, but that's going to make things better for you. It's going to lower these symptoms, and they go, yeah, it would, absolutely. And then a week later they come back and I go, well, how did that work for you? Well, I didn't really remember it, or I didn't really think about it this way or whatever. Oh, yeah, understandable. It is hard. It's hard to bring that into play. So that does happen from time to time as well.
Yeah. One of the reason I believe it's the narrative which has been passed down culturally or generationally about masculinity, especially with the regard of expression of emotions. So I think it is also one of the main reasons why the men kind of, do they feel shame, or is it awkwardness? What is it?
Well, I think you bring up a good point. In my experience, part of it is not understanding what emotions they're actually feeling. It's when if you present emotions to a man, typically, so like one of the tools, and you see is you can get them online. There's a ton of them, but emotional wheels. They can be 2 levels deep, some are like 8 levels deep. There's a whole bunch of them. If you present that to a woman or versus you present that to a man, a woman's going to probably be able to. Most women are going to be able to parse through some of those and be okay. Well, I can find this one. They could probably name, maybe on average 8 or 9 of them probably that they've felt. Most men, if you say, okay, what did you feel? Happiness, sadness, anger. Those are the 3, over and over and over again. And to me, that's an understanding that you feel other things, but you don't know how to understand what those are. And so you only look at those through those 3 lenses. So typically when people say, well, I have an anger problem, really what that usually means that they have a fear problem, that they're afraid of something, they're anxious about something, whatever. It just shows up as anger because that's how they know how to describe it. So I think, along with what you're saying, I think certainly there's an idea that, okay, this is what masculinity is. It's not sharing your feelings, but it's also not describing your feelings. It's not being able to say, this is what I really feel, because that takes a lot of introspection. And one of the things I realized as I've gotten older is that men tend to not do a lot of introspection. In that sense, they tend to sort of do it, passively, through periods of, quiet. But for the most part, they don't usually do a lot of introspection. It's usually kind of like momentary, and then we kind of move on. And so when you're asked to go back and look at it again, you may not remember it in any type of detail because you're thinking about it through those 3 lenses: happiness, sadness, anger. I do think that's one thing that comes up quite a bit. I've seen part of the work that I've done for my own stuff, my own business, was actually developing some insight to that, was to help people understand what I call emotional quality, understanding what the depth of that is. What really are you feeling? What are you experiencing? Can you label that? And then being able to articulate that in that way. So I'd say in my opinion, that's part of the reason why people don't get very detailed. And again, in therapy as well, because they just don't know how to describe what they're experiencing.
But Now there have been so much talk about men's mental health, and there is a lot of books. There is a lot of open in the on that front, but still it's hard for men to open up even with their closest people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, men's relationships, and again, just speaking from my experience, I think men's relationships, and maybe I'm probably a little abnormal in this sense. I have a couple really good guys in my life that I have that I feel like are a little abnormal in that sense. They're a little more willing to talk about some of the things, their struggles. It may not be super deep, but at least they have the one friend I'm thinking of particularly. Me and him have a good relationship and talking through that. And I know he's done some therapy, so we have kind of that relationship. We kind of talk about different struggles. But some men, there's an element of I think where it's not necessarily a desire to want to not open up about it, but I think it's the way you talk about it. Certainly that, when you talk about, because I was mentioning before kind of how my story started. I had people, men and women, but a lot of them were guys that would come and talk to you about relational struggles, right? And a lot of times it comes off as complaining. It's not necessarily coming off as like, deep emotional speak or, hey, I feel this way or whatever. A lot of times it's, I can't believe that she did this. I can't believe he did this, right? So some of those things, I think I think there is a little bit of what does it mean for people to open up? What does that dialogue look like? And we don't necessarily know how to train our kids to talk like that. We don't necessarily know how to learn how to adjust our own talking like that. So a lot of times when we use the word in therapy called processing, people process all the time. They process about everything. But the thing about processing is that processing is only so good, right? It's just like a computer, right? It's kind of like the wheels continue to spin. Eventually there's going to come a point where, okay, processing's awesome. Thank you for letting that out and letting that energy out, so to speak. But what are you going to do about that processing? Because if you just all you do is process and process and process, process, you're never going to be able to necessarily make the next step. And I say that to you to my own self because I'm a real good processor, but doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to apply anything to what I've complained about. What do I need to do differently? So I think that's a big part. So I think part of that is that emotional speak. How do we talk to each other? How do we talk about things that go on? And we kind of circling back to some stuff we talked about before. You add the internet, you add in screens. People throw their opinions out a lot of different things because there's this divider between us. It's the screen, and so there isn't a lot of space where sometimes actually some of the most emotional conversations are done online because they don't think there's going to be any repercussions. So I think there's another part of that too, is that if I'm live with somebody, certainly as a man, if I start telling you about, hey, I'm really struggling with this thing, I run the risk of being vulnerable that my friend I'm talking to is not going to reject me in that sense. And I think we all run the risk of that in what relationship. So I think from a vulnerability perspective, there is, men struggle with the vulnerability of why is this an issue for me? I think that would probably be the best way to put it.
From your experience, how does men approach or how open are they towards counseling or therapy?
I think it really depends on what they're coming in for. As a general practitioner, I've seen, unless they're going through something really life changing like a divorce or symptoms that they can't explain, those are probably the two big ones I would say. There's usually something that drives them. There's some, event that drives them into therapy, right? It's not because, hey, I woke up today, I just don't feel right. I need to talk to somebody about it. It's rarely that. It's usually there's some event that causes them. And again, I think that's true for most people, but certainly for men, that's a big one. When I was working with addiction, the event was some type of breach in the relate. Typically, it was a breach in the relationship. So I'm dating somebody, I'm married to somebody, they caught me watching porn for maybe it's the third time, fourth time, 10th time, whatever it is. And they finally put a boundary up and said, either you're going to counseling or this relationship's over. And usually that kind of thing is something that will then drive them in. Now, what I found is that again, there's once you're in, that's the first part. Then the part of then actually continuing is the ongoing. And those are the moments where, okay, like then you have to make the decision of, okay, like is this good for you to continue, or is it better for you just to continue to burn out with it? In my opinion, I think that if you plateaued and got a lot better, then that work needs to be recognized, and you may need to take a pause from the program and come back to it later. Now, again, partners aren't going to feel that way, and I totally understand that. But I think from a therapeutic perspective, again, how much again, therapy burnout's real, and from that perspective, I think for sort of working with addiction that long.
What are some of the signs of distress or struggling in men a family member can see and try to help them?
Yeah, I've had this question before, and it always gets hard because that's, I mean, there's only so much encouragement can do. I mean, I do think there's a limitation of, again, pursue, pushing a person into therapy is never going to be a good move. I've had people, usually people go to therapy after the point that they've already should have been in therapy. So like this is very common for couples who are probably on the road to divorce or couples on a road breaking up if they're not married usually come to therapy as the last resort when really that probably should be their first place that they go. But commonly what happens is they try to work it out together. They try to do all these different things. They go on vacations, etc. And all of a sudden, well, this is the last. And sometimes that's what they're looking for. They're looking for someone to validate that they really should break up. So that does happen from time to time. That is not a good model for men to go into therapy because again, it's like one of those things. If I have somebody in my family who continues to tell me, "Hey, you should go to therapy. You should go to therapy. You should go," I'm probably going to become more resistant. I don't want to necessarily step into that unless I'm the one motivated to go in there. So I think that that's a big part of that is like don't push the agenda, so to speak, I guess I'd call it, onto the person. I think the therapist space too, and the biggest thing a family member I think can do is just really put yourself in an availability or a position to be present, basically, because I think for a lot of guys, especially when it comes to, again, going into therapy, there's going to be the hesitation of wanting to step into that. But if I can make myself more present, maybe that's going to help me start to see a little bit of those. And what I mean by present is just like, hey, do you want to talk about that? Or do you be comfortable sitting and talking about, like, if you're a spouse, make yourself, rather than, going about all the things that they're not doing, maybe it's more of, hey, is there something going on? Try to be more neutral in that sense rather than trying to necessarily direct them in that way. If you're another family member, maybe you're like a brother or something like that, can you again make time for that person? I think is a big part of that.
And even if you push, it is like only the first session, but how do you continue?
Yeah, and so that's the thing. Like the first session is never. I will say this, almost 90% of the time, the first session will never be like any of the other sessions you're going to go through. Most sessions where you will see the greatest improvement of symptomology is probably somewhere between 3 to 6 months, just because the natural progression of the relationship you have with the therapist. That its clinical relationship is probably one of the greatest relationships you have as far as your success with therapy. It's A, what's your willingness to be open, and B, what's your therapeutic relation with your counselor. The counselors are really limited. Like one of the things I found with addiction was that, when you work at the beginning of the thing, you can give all this detail at the beginning and you give all this information. Okay, do this, do these things. Okay, well, great. Well, that only goes through 4, 5, 6 sessions. When you run out of the information, then you have to start. That's when you have to start becoming to the hard stuff and being more deeper and talking more and doing those kind of things. And so some men would come in, they love that, right? That you get them all this information, they make this huge jump from session 2 to 4 or whatever, and then they're like, oh, well, this is great. Well, I'm gonna keep going because I'm seeing it work. Being a general practitioner is much more harder in that sense because you have to give a little bit of here's some information, but then also here's how this is going to go, and you have to kind of find that balance. So I think when you're talking about men, consistently being in therapy, it comes from the perspective of kind of give you a little bit of physical that you do this way to see it improve, and then we're going to give you a little bit of that space where you need to open up, and it's going to be on you. And so that's really where that's all therapeutic, skills. You have to kind of know where that balance is. In regards to kind of like you said, like the ongoing piece of that, as far as family members go, not necessarily asking them. I think when you ask people what they talk about in therapy, again, that's almost like an invasion of privacy to some degree. Is that you got to look at it as, okay, like if they're willing to tell me what happened in therapy, awesome. If they're not, then I'm kind of saying, okay, hey, like did you find therapy to be useful today? Might be a good question, because you might get a yes or no. Okay, great. Well, then I might just need to leave it there. A lot of times you have the person, they go to therapy, they come back, and the first thing their partner says, well, how's therapy today? What did you talk about? Well, the whole reason I'm going to therapy is not to tell you, right? That's the whole idea. So that's the issue. So like, I think there's a little bit of as a family member, how do you support them by encouraging them to continue to go, but not by prying and not by giving more information? And this happened, when I was working with addiction, that happened all the time. Like partners want to know more details because they've been closed out for so long. So I understand why they want to know those things. And by no means am I saying I don't think those are bad questions to ask at some point. But at the beginning of the process and certainly through most of the process, that's probably not the best space to be in.
Yeah, it does get tricky. When to be out of the picture, when to show concern, when to show support. Yeah, it's a tricky thing.
Yeah. And it's all person to person. You might have somebody who, loves to share what happened and is real open about those kind of things and wants to have that relationship with you. And then there might be other people that the reason I'm going to therapy is to not have to tell you about the things I'm struggling with. So you kind of have to respect that aspect too.
Yeah, truly. We are towards the end of this episode, and I'm going to ask you three questions as a takeaway. What is working well in mental health, and what is not working well in mental health?
Well, I'm relaunching my business, moving into cultural changes in mental health. So that's actually a great question. But I think what's working well, I think overall throughout the world, but certainly in the United States, I can only speak from what we're experiencing in the United States, the movement toward people being more open about what we talked about earlier, how you talk about emotions, how you talk about, concerns, issues, etc. In a lot of ways, that's great. That's improved a lot. The flip side of that is that yes, it's improved, but at the same time, like, don't let that be the only thing we're talking about. I think there's an aspect of that too. So there needs to be kind of that balance. Again, a lot of these things are balance based, but I do think the number one thing is that it has improved in that conversation. What isn't working well, what continues to work well is exactly what I was just talking about. Is I feel like the financial aspect of how therapists, and that's an episode of itself, but the financial aspect of how therapists get paid, the cultural issues within the therapeutic world, the issues with how therapists interact with each other, the hierarchies of how those things work, the systems in place, at least in the United States, are really need of an overhaul. And part of my business that I'm switching over is to start working and helping cultures and practices change, because ultimately the ones that hurt the most are the people that are the clients. There's a lot of great therapists out there, but they work in horrible systems. And so part of the system is, if we can improve that, then maybe that will impact the overall mental health, not only of the practice, but also of the clients that we work with.
How can parents build trust and have an open connection or a communication with their kids?
Trust is tough to build across the board, no matter what. I think trust in any relationship, you see it modeled in the same kind of way you could with a child. The number one thing I think is that, what I would go back to, a word that I like a lot, is consistency. What are you consistent at doing as a parent? Are you consistently inconsistent? Or are you consistently, doing the same things that your boundaries, your rules, they're the same across the board. So what I mean by that is that, a child gets very confused if it doesn't really understand, doesn't know why he can do one thing over here and he gets punished a certain way, and then he does the same thing over here and gets punished differently. So it's really important that both parents have the same, I don't want to use the word ideology, but similar ideology of how they're going to discipline, what's their goal, how they're going to raise their child. I think that's really important, because mom and dad can't have conflicting pieces there. If they do, you're going to have the classic, we'll go ask your mother type of spots, and then that's not going to go well either. So I think building trust means that, you're coherent with your partner as parents, and then that coherency also, then also spills over into being the same with your child, and not necessarily treating your child as an adult, or necessarily treating your child as an equal in that sense, but certainly as the idea that you're treating your child as a human. I think that's a big part of it. And part of that being human is to, in their best way, explain to them, what your concerns are, why this is a concern, why this is an issue, but also with authority, continue to enforce the rules you have. I think when you do that, you demonstrate that you're ally to them. I think that you're showing that you still care about them, you still want them the best for them, but you're not willing to tolerate a certain level of behavior, and that's okay. I think we've gotten to a point where we really, I don't want to say we victimized parents, but we certainly made parents authority figures to a certain degree as being harmful to children when they're not. Children need direction. Children need structure. If they're in chaos, they're not gonna trust anything, because how can they trust if there's complete chaos in the home, and there's just how it's going to be. So I think building trust comes, I guess I'll break it down in three ways. One, it comes from the consistency. It comes to the ability to be able to be an ally, or an an authoritative ally, maybe is the best way to put that. And then I think the third part of that is then also, you know, and I hate the word, use the word partner, but certainly the idea that you're, maybe explaining yourself, or being open to what the reasoning why you have certain boundaries and rules, et cetera. But it also shows them and demonstrates to them that boundaries are okay, right? A lot of times boundaries, there's certain groups of people who hate boundaries, and they become what they call people pleasers, and then they have no boundaries. So there's an element of that where it's like a child should not have to try to earn love as much as they are who they are, and they're going to be they're going to be cared for by the parents, even if they're in disagreement on things. And they're very well to be potential of that disagreement still existing, but still also having alignment with them because you are their parent and because they're your child. And I think that develops the trust as time goes on with that.
What's one message will you give to a man who is struggling silently?
Well, I think the first thing, and it's going to sound cliche, but again, that anyone, no matter if men and women, it doesn't matter who it is, but certainly for men, that they're not alone in their struggles. I think we've dehumanized a lot of, well, I don't say we dehumanize men, but I think we dehumanize the experience because, part of being human is going to struggle with the whole wheel we talked about earlier. It's not just about, doing XYZ. It's not just about the way you behave or what you provide. I mean, there's certainly elements of that in the role, but there is also, you're also fully a person as well as you are, a provider. And I think people that are struggling silently may feel like they are not going to be accepted for their struggles. And so part of that is that if you're struggling silently, know that you're not alone in that aspect, but also at the same time know that you are experiencing something that's completely normal because that's part of being human. A lot of times, I think what we do is we tend to look at it as, this season or this thing or whatever is going on in my life is just, if I don't deal with it, it'll just go away. And most of the time that never works, right? It just gets pushed down. Things get put on top of it. And I always think about like if you shake a pop bottle and it'll eventually blow up. Something will happen where it will end up coming apart. And that's typically what most people experience with their mental health. Some event happens in their life that they, a loss, a grief, a struggle, whatever it might be, and they are carrying that burden and they don't let it out. What will end up happening is, and again, we've seen this most recently, a lot of trauma conversations around the body that keeps the score, that book. More things we're holding on to, the more things our body's going to show up with. So what I've seen is people, have some tragedy in their life and they go 20 years without talking about it. And then all of a sudden something happens in their life that forces them to slow down. They retire, they get injured in some way, they can't move the same way. And all those moments of silence, what comes back? All that thing that they didn't deal with before 20 years earlier. So when you're struggling with silence, I think is that just know that it may be silent now, but there will be a point somewhere in your life that will no longer be silent. And what are you going to do about that? Because eventually you'll have to deal with that. There's no shame in that. And there's no shame in the fact that you are a human being for struggling with that, because we all have those. And of course, that's easy for me to say that. But the reality of it is the fact that for all of us, if we keep something in silence, it'll get a voice somewhere along the way. They just don't know when that will be.
Yeah, I love that book. Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Discovering Journeys. I would love for this podcast to reach as many people as possible. So please remember to subscribe, rate, and leave a positive review. Share this podcast with someone you think who would appreciate this conversation. Check out the show notes for all the links and details. Until next time, keep embracing your journey and discovering new paths.